In Chapter 16, we're going to be looking in a little more detail on communities and looking at the nature of communities. Now, so far, we've been looking at two-way relationships. So we've been looking at things like mutualisms, competition, predator-prey interactions, and interactions like that have only involved two species. But we know that in nature, species interact with more than just one other species. And so we're going to have to start looking at communities in a broader scale in these larger webs. So we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in class, but in this video, I just want to talk very briefly about how communities are defined. Then we're going to look at how communities are impacted by species composition. So when you have more species versus less species, how does that impact something called community services? And then we're going to end by talking about keystone species, which is really partially covered by the community services talk. So when we talk about communities, we can look at them in many different ways, but the two kind of major ways that we can look at them is physically or biologically. Now, communities, just to remind you, are groups of interacting species in the same place at the same time. Now, you can look at them just physically, so look at a particular part of the world, a particular area, a particular sand dune or stream or desert, for instance, and just look at all the species that are found in that environment. However, we know that species interact at a broader scale than just in one location. So species in the sand dune might actually be impacted by species that are not in the sand dune. And so you might want to look a little bit more broadly, in which case you'll have a biologically defined community where you look at all species that are associated with a particular area. So anything that impacts a kelp forest, for instance, would be considered. Whether or not it actually lives in the kelp forest doesn't matter. It's whether it interacts with the kelp forest that matters. So both of these are methods that you can use to define your community. We can also look at communities in terms of taxonomy or guild or functional group. And this is very useful for ecologists because we don't have to just look at particular species. We can actually say, well, I want to look at all the birds and how birds interact with non-birds. And it might not be particularly narrowing down between different species of finch, for instance, or different species of warbler. I just say, birds are going to be one group. You can also say guild-wise. You might say all the species that eat pollen versus the pollinated species, so plants that provide pollen. And you might look at those interactions. So rather than narrowing it down to just a bat and a flowering plant, you might have bats and birds and insects that all eat pollen. And similarly, you might do functional groups. So anything that does a similar function might be grouped together. And this makes it easier for ecologists to study these larger systems where you may have many different organisms performing similar tasks. Right? Okay, so in class, we'll look at a little bit more detail at this idea of communities and different ways of defining communities. But for the purpose of this video, I want to talk about, well, what happens when we add more species? So, when we add species to a community, how does that impact the function of the community? Now, communities have many functions. They need to provide resources for all of the organisms living within the community, and those resources come in many different ways. What happens when we add or subtract species from a community? How does that impact how healthy that community is? Now, in the 1950s, a researcher named Charles Elkton proposed something called the diversity stability hypothesis, which pretty simply said that more species are better than less species. And the more species there are, the more stable a community is. And as a community loses species richness, it gradually loses community services. And he viewed this as a linear relationship, so doubling the species, double the community services. And community services can be things like pollination, or food production, or shelter, or various other services that communities provide to other community members. Right? So the more trees there are, the more shelter there is. The more insects there are, the more pollinators there are. and so on and so forth. And so as you add species, you add community services. Now this seems pretty straightforward, but most ecologists would agree that it's not as simple as this, that some species are not as important as other species. And so in the 80s, these other researchers proposed a hypothesis called the rivet hypothesis, and they said species don't all provide the same resource roles. Some species are more critical than others, and that basically species are like rivets on an airplane, in that they all provide a role, yes, but you're not going to lose function in an orderly fashion. That you could lose some species and still have pretty much the same services. So you think, I have several different insect species. Losing a few of them is not the end of the world. Losing too many, though, and you're going to really weaken the community. And so they say, some species provide small but critical roles in keeping the community functioning, whereas others are not as critical as the others. So certain ones are going to cause great declines in community services, whereas other species, the loss of them doesn't really weaken the community too much. Right? Okay, so this really gets us into thinking about specific species and how specific species might play specific roles. Now, one thing is that some species are going to be more abundant than others. We call these dominant species. So dominant species are organisms that are in large quantity and by virtue of their abundance provide a large role. So for instance, in a kelp forest, kelp are pretty abundant and they play a pretty big role because they're so abundant. So yes, another different species of kelp might be able to take the place of that role, but they're not so abundant. So losing an abundant species would be hugely impactful. If you lose one of the rarer species, it's not going to really change the services of that community as much. So dominant species. Dominant species can also be considered what's called an ecosystem engineer, because they themselves, through their biology, modifies or maintains the habitat for other species. So another way to look at communities is redundancy. So what role do they play? Are there 12 different species that all provide the same function? So are there 12 different pollinators? If so, then maybe loss of one is not going to be as important as loss of anything else. So this is a little bit different than the dominant species idea, where certain species are more important than others. This is looking at functions and redundancy in the functions of the different species. So in this case, loss of the redundant species plays really no impact in community service, but if you lose enough of them, it's going to cause a dramatic decline in them. And then a final way that we can look at community services is the keystone species hypothesis. And the keystone species says that there are some species out there that play a hugely critical role even when they're not abundant. And this is the key thing here, is that they play a much larger role than would be expected by their biomass. So an example of this would be a top predator. So for instance, piesaster or sea stars. They feed on many different species in the intertidal, and because of that role that they play, even though they're not nearly as abundant as some of the other species, snails and barnacles and limpets are going to be way more abundant than starfish, because they feed on so many different things, their loss would have a dramatic influence on that community structure. It would cause a huge change. And so it's, despite its low biomass, having the ability to influence many different organisms. So these would be things like top predators, but it could also be things at the bottom of the food web as well. So if there was a species at the bottom that was fed on by many different things, and it played a critical role or a critical diet function of that community, it would also be a keystone species. So keystone species are ones that play a large role in their environment. So just to look at these two concepts of keystone species versus dominant species, this is a graph that looks at impact of species versus biomass of species. And you'd expect that species that are large in biomass would play a larger role than species that were smaller in biomass. However, organisms that play a larger role than anticipated, so these species that fall on the left side of this line, although they may not be overly abundant, they have a huge impact. These would be what we call keystone species. So their effects are out of proportion to their biomass. On the right-hand side of this red line are species that have a large biomass and not quite as big an impact. And so they're important simply because they're abundant, not necessarily because they provide some role that is critical. So dominant species are important because they're abundant. Keystone species are important whether or not they're abundant. They're important beyond simple abundance level.